The reason for this video is the looming deadline of April 1st, 2022. Some of you have been hearing about that deadline, and there's been a lot of questions and a lot of conjecture about it. And I kind of want to clear all that up based on what I know about what's going on in the South Georgia Conference and in the United Methodist Church. You know, comes to no surprise to anyone that the United Methodist Church is divided. We've known it for many years. And in fact, it's been going on for 50 years. If you want to know more about the history of the divide, I'll leave a link down below so you can check out another video. And it details all the General Conference actions around the issue of sexuality that we've gone through in the past 50 years. But we've come to a decision, most of us anyway, that you cannot walk two different paths together. So a lot of people on both sides of the fence have decided that maybe now is the time for disaffiliation. And disaffiliation was something that was provided under the 2019 Call General Conference of the United Methodist Church. And they did so in the passage in the Book of Discipline in paragraph 2553 called the disaffiliation of the local church over issues related to human sexuality. Now, if you look in that, it says that the deadline for disaffiliation is December 31st, 2023. Well, that definitely does not match this deadline that we're talking about, April 1st, 2022. So let's see if we can get from December 31st, 2023 back to the deadline that's being discussed here in South Georgia. In order to have things recognized, or our annual conference, the South Georgia Conference, in order to have things on the docket for the June conference, we have to have that submitted by March 1st. And that is this year. If you're talking about disaffiliation, you know, there's some things that have to go on before it comes time for you to submit your paperwork. You would probably need to meet with the DS. And that is where the April 1st part of this deadline comes in. Well, that gets us to April 1st, 2023, but the deadline we're talking about is April 1st, 2022. So how do we get from April 2023 being the deadline to really saying that the deadline is April 1st, 2022? Well, it really comes down to the three possible ways in which disaffiliation could happen. We're going to use Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C, and these are not by any means official plans. They are just observations by many people in our conference as to how we could disaffiliate. The first way I'm going to call Plan A, and it goes something like this. If General Conference happens, you know, right now they're meeting, even probably right now as I'm speaking, they're meeting to determine whether or not General Conference will happen or not this year, or whether they're going to put it off. If they do vote to have General Conference and General Conference takes place, there is a piece of legislation that has been proposed called the Protocol. And the protocol was established in 2020. It was a protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation. And it was a professionally negotiated peace treaty proposed to divide the United Methodist Church. It was designed by a group of 16 diverse members, 16 members of that were traditional, that were progressive, and that were centrist. If General Conference happens and the protocol gets voted on and it passes, then the South Georgia Annual Conference could petition to leave the United Methodist Church as a whole. I believe this is the plan that all the churches in South Georgia are really hoping happens. It all depends, though, on General Conference. So the first plan is that if General Conference happens, hopefully they'll vote on the protocol, hopefully they'll pass the protocol, and then the South Georgia Conference could leave as a whole, and we don't have to disaffiliate as individual churches. The second plan is in the case that General Conference does not happen again. If General Conference does not happen again because it's been continually put off time and time again, there's a lot of people that are guessing that the South Georgia Conference would probably draft a legislation to petition to leave the United Methodist Church as a whole. But the Book of Discipline doesn't give an annual conference any expressed way that they can leave the United Methodist Church as a whole. You know, it's unprecedented. So the bishop would probably rule that out of order, at which point in time it would go to the Judicial Council. Now, who are the Judicial Council? Well, the Judicial Council, if you think about it, it's like the Supreme Court of the United Methodist Church. The Judicial Council basically is made up of states. It's all from the United States, and people that are representatives of each one of these areas, and they basically make a ruling on what is legal and what is not legal in Methodism. So Plan B would be, if General Conference doesn't happen, the South Georgia Conference could petition to leave. The bishop would probably rule that out of order, and it would go to the Judicial Council to vote, and whether they vote yes or no would determine whether or not the South Georgia Conference would be able to leave the United Methodist Church as a whole. But then there's a third plan, and I believe it's the more sure plan. If General Conference does not happen, the Judicial Council may vote a new progressive bishop over South Georgia. And this is something that's been talked about in a lot of circles. We have had an interim bishop, and Bishop Graves has been our interim bishop ever since the retirement of our previous bishop. And that's worked really well for us, but I don't think that's worked really well in other places. And as a result, I think that the Judicial Council is feeling pressure to appoint more bishops. And that being said, I believe that probably the bishops that will be presented or approved will be progressive bishops. Seeing as how Georgia already has a bishop, we have a bishop of the North Georgia Conference. There's a possibility that the Judicial Council may place that bishop over South Georgia. And that bishop is incredibly out of step with the beliefs and feelings of the South Georgia Conference. If that happens, if we end up underneath a progressive bishop, then disaffiliation becomes much more difficult and much more costly. So where the April 1st, 2022 deadline comes from is right now, for annual conference, a church can begin the process of disaffiliation, and it needs to talk to the DS by April 1st, 2022. Disaffiliation is not final until the cost of disaffiliation is paid. So what am I saying? I'm saying that the reason why people have been talking about this April 1st, 2022 deadline is because it is the only sure way that you can disaffiliate and still retain your property and all your assets. It's only surefire way. Every other way is fraught with ifs and what ifs. So that is the reason why there's a push, or there's a deadline that's being talked about in South Georgia. Now, what does this mean? And I am not by any means telling you that you need to do one thing or the other. This is what I am telling you, is that if your church hasn't discussed it by April 1st, 2022, and this deadline passes you by, it was just my desire for my church to at least have had a say, for the laity to at least have a chance to weigh in. And if the deadline passes because we choose for it to pass, that is one thing. But if the deadline passes because we're negligent, or because we're not knowledgeable, or because we're apathetic, I think that's a tragedy. It is good for United Methodists in South Georgia everywhere to have some serious conversations before April 1st, 2022.